Welcome. We are very honored to have Dr. Liyakat Takim is going to be giving us a lecture today. And his focus is going to be on Islamic virtue ethics within Islam. So we're very honored to have him. Professor Takim is the Sharjah Chair for Islamic Studies at McMaster University. He's taught previously at the University of Denver in the Religious Studies Department, and a little bit further back here in Miami itself at the University of Miami. So we're very honored to welcome Dr. Takim back to Miami and to FIU, and excited for a wonderful lecture on Islamic virtue ethics from an American-Islamic perspective.
How long do I have for?
Class finishes at 3:15. So
3:15. So
even if you want to do 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and then we can do the question and answer, that's fine.
okay.
Yeah. Do you have any slides or anything? Or just
No,
your
no,
topic?
just
Okay.
this. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Oops, in front of you, to share a few thoughts on virtue ethics. But I wanted to focus more on the question of social justice and human rights, and connect that with Imam Hussein, because that's what Professor Akhtar asked me to talk about. The claim for human rights is based on the idea that they are rights of all human beings by virtue of them being members of the human family, without distinctions of race, gender, religion, etc. But in the Islamic perspective, at least, human rights needs to have a universal moral foundation, which is connected to the human conscience. So human relations is interwoven in the Islamic tradition to a moral discourse that unites all human beings. It's what we may call a universal morality, which is conjoined to values ingrained in the conscience of all human beings. And I'm going to talk about primarily from a Quranic perspective, how the Quran talks of human rights. There's a very important verse in this. You've heard of 2020, right? This is 30:30, chapter 30, verse 30 in the Quran, which talks of a universal ethical language. That is what is called the fitra. We don't have anything to write by. FITRA, fitra, which is what we may call a universal language, or in an ingrained disposition that all human beings can connect to and engage in. So we can talk of fitra, FITRA, as a kind of a universal guidance. And we need to understand that there are two main terms here when we talk of this universal guidance. One is that it is universal, and second, that it is moral. So regardless of a person's religious or ethnic background, all human beings can somehow relate to this fitra. And importantly, this is an ingrained conscience that talks to us independent of religion and independent of revelation. In other words, regardless of your religious or ethnic or whatever background, all human beings are able to connect to it. The universal guidance also demands universal or uniform ethical standards. It's a kind of a moral compass. It provides moral directions to individual. And to put it differently, that human beings have an imprint of God within them. And that God's imprint is to be found in every human conscience. Nobody is ignorant of what is right and wrong, as the Quran tells us, that the Quran says that we have revealed what is right and what is wrong to every human beings. To put it differently, reason then is God's gift to humanity. And it is through this reason that human beings can develop the sense of moral consciousness. Therefore, human beings do not need to share religion in order to get along. They need to share common moral commitments. This sense of universal moral values and discourse is seen in the story of creation in the Quran itself. Because the story of creation is unique, whereby human beings have been endowed with certain features. It's not only the common consciousness, but there is a common humanity also. So, for example, the Quran talks of God breathing His Spirit into Adam. وَنَفَخْتُ فِيهِ مِنْ رُوحِي. In other words, God, according to the Quran, breathed His Spirit into Adam and then taught him the names. Now, there are different interpretations of what these names mean. For many Muslims, it means that it gave Adam knowledge. So, there is what we may call, when we in the Islamic tradition talk of inspire, or I'm inspired, literally it means that I carry God's Spirit. And therefore, when somebody expires, is the Spirit leaves him or her. So, inspire and expire can have different meaning in the Islamic tradition. So, first, human beings have got this inspired, that is God's Spirit in them. Secondly, they have been taught the names of God, or the divine knowledge. Then there is, of course, the fitrah that I was talking about, the guidance of what is right and what is wrong. And the fourth element that all human beings have in them, according to chapter 33, verse 72, that the verse says, "Inna aradna al-aman ala samawati wal ard." We, that is God, offered the trust to the heavens and the earth, but they refused to take it, and they were fearful of it. And human beings accepted the trust. Innahu kana zaluman jahula. But he or she, human beings, have proven to be ungrateful, and they have deviated from this trust. So human beings then, and the trust again is interpreted in different ways. Just as the names is seen as the knowledge of God, the trust is seen as the is freedom, free will, according to some at least. The Quran goes even further when it talks of this human rights and human consciousness, that human beings are equal in creation because of a common parenthood. In fact, the Quran states that we as human beings are related before we are created. We tend to think of our challenge as to relate to each other, but according to chapter 4, verse 1 in the Quran, Ya ayyuhan nas, O human beings, be aware of your duties to God who created you from one essence. So all human beings emerge from one essence, at least in the Quranic understanding. Not only are we emerging from the same essence, but we also share the common parenthood, that is Adam and Eve. All human beings, Ya ayyuhan nas, O human beings, inna khalaqnakum min dhakarin wa untha, we created you from one male and one female, and we made you into different tribes and different nations so that you may know each other. In other words, human beings are coming from the same parenthood, but they are different so that they can know and understand each other rather than fight each other. And crucially, the verse ends with the important point saying, Inna akramakum indallahi atqakum. Indeed, the most honorable of you in the eyes of God is the one who is most pious. So it is piety or moral consciousness that gives value to a human being rather than anything else. So human rights also stems in the Quranic understanding from a sense of inherent dignity that is given to all human beings. In other words, all human beings have been dignified by God. Chapter 17, verse 70 says, "Liyakat karramna bani Adama," that we have dignified the children of Adam. So all human beings have this sense of dignity. And it is karama, that is the dignity, that enables people of different faith and cultures to get along. In other words, as I said earlier, we do not need to share a religion to get along. We need to share a sense of moral consciousness to get along. So human beings then, based on this sense of dignity, can get along without compromising on their beliefs and on their culture. There is an important verse that was revealed in the early period of Muhammad's life in Mecca, Lakum dinukum waliyadin, when he is addressing the non-believers, that you worship what you worship and I do not worship what you worship, you don't worship what I worship. But to you is your way and to me is mine. By the way, the word deen does not necessarily mean religion in the Quran. It has different meanings, and deen in this sense means you have your way of doing things, your path, I have mine. The uniting principle for human beings then is not necessarily their submission to God. Rather, what unites human beings is their common guidance, their common sense of what is right and what is wrong. To put it differently, as human beings in the Quranic understanding, we have a spiritual commitment to God, and yet we also have a moral commitment to fellow human beings. You cannot divest one from the other. To be spiritual, you have to be moral. And to be moral, you have to be spiritual. Reverence for God is at a vertical plane, and reverence for human beings is at the horizontal plane. Human dignity also entails human freedom. In other words, human beings are free to accept or reject a religious tradition and even leave a religious tradition. In other words, according to the Quran at least, no human being has a right to come between you and your Lord. There's a very famous and important tradition in the Quran, La ikraha fid din. There is no compulsion in religion. And there's one issue here which has arisen, and even recently you may have heard of this case in Pakistan of Asia Bibi. The question of blasphemy or the question of apostasy, that if a person who is born a Muslim, can he or she decide to leave their religion? The traditional Islamic from the jurists is that a Muslim cannot apostatize. In other words, he or she cannot leave Islam. If he or she does, then should be killed. But that is being challenged now, by the way, that this law was not in the Quran, that this law of apostasy came about at a particular point or time in history because apostasy was causing chaos or anarchy in the Islamic tradition. And therefore many jurists now are revising this law, that there is a freedom of conscience in Islam, that a human being can choose to leave Islam or to remain a Muslim. Similarly, the question of blasphemy too, again, that this was contextual, that because you may have heard of this case of Asia Bibi in Pakistan right now, who has been accused of blasphemy, and she has been acquitted, but there's a large backlash against the Prime Minister Imran Khan at the moment. The unity then in the Quran is through humanity, and that human beings need to care and share for others and share humanity with others. Humanity in the Islamic tradition also means that one cannot afford to be morally neutral. We cannot afford to be indifferent, because when we are indifferent, then our consciousness becomes blurred. In other words, as human beings, we must not only be aware, but we must be ethical in our actions. As Martin Luther King said very correctly, that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So one cannot afford to be morally neutral whenever there is something wrong. And interestingly, when the Quran talks of fighting against injustice, and it does talk about that a lot, it never mentions the religion of the person who is being unjustly treated. It doesn't say that you only help Muslims who are being madhloom, those who are oppressed. It says wherever there is oppression, stand up and fight, or at least say something about it. And it is within this context, and I want to talk about Imam Hussein, or Hussein as he is called, the grandson of the Prophet. Remember, it's important to understand that Islam is very much for justice. Indeed, as I was talking about in Miami-Dade earlier today morning, that the Quran itself does not prescribe any form of government. In fact, the word government, hukuma in Arabic, does not occur in the Quran at all. So you can have, technically, you can have democracy, you can have autocracy, you can have theocracy, any other nomocracy, any kind of cracy you want, as long as two things, justice and equality, are fulfilled. Because the Quran talks of the purpose of government, not the form. So you have so many Muslims say, we cannot have democracy, Islam is against democracy. That's not true, at least not in my view. Because it's the purpose of the government is discussed in the Quran, not the form. Any kind of form, as long as there is justice and equality and human beings are free. It is within this framework then we can understand the events of Karbala. I think you already know a little bit about Karbala, correct? You've covered Karbala in your course, I think. In any case then, Karbala is can only be properly understood in the light of the doctrine or belief in Tawheed. Tawheed meaning the oneness of God. Because Tawheed, oneness of God, is not only a theological demand in the Quran that you must believe in one God. There are deep implications to that belief in one God. That Tawheed demands spiritual and moral awareness within a Muslim. In other words, just because a person says that he or she is a Muslim doesn't mean that much. He or she must not only be praying and fasting, but also must be socially and politically aware. Tawheed demands loyalty to God only, not to thrones. And therefore there is a deep connection between faith and upright actions. You will see that wherever the Quran talks of Iman or faith, you have upright actions connected to it. And part of these upright actions is to stand up against injustice. It is very interesting that in English we say that I have faith in God, for example. In Arabic you never say I have faith in God. You don't say li iman billahi or indi iman. You say amantu billahi, which literally means I am doing faith in God, which is very awkward to translate. Or u'minu billahi, I am acting faith in God, because faith is seen as something very transitive, is very active. It's not something passive. I think that part of the problem in English language is we have not really distinguished between belief and faith. Sometimes we use the two as if that they are the same. Belief and faith. I believe in God, I have faith in God. Well, I can say I believe in God, but can I say I have faith in Satan? If I have faith in Satan, I'm in problem. In other words, Muslims are supposed to believe in God or even believe in Satan because he is part of the Quranic discourse. But to have faith in something is something different. In other words, to be connected to a particular being. And that connection to God requires a socially active human being. So the actions of Imam Hussein show the link between faith and human dignity. That as human beings we cannot be morally indifferent, and that we must have ideals that we are prepared to give our lives for. As somebody correctly said, that if you have nothing to die for, then you have nothing to live for. Then, in other words, as human beings, we must be socially active and prepared to give up our lives, if necessary, for ideals like justice or equality. The actions of Hussein occurring in Karbala in the year 680, from Shia Muslims especially, they cause deep spiritual and moral awareness in them. You probably have seen pictures or videos of Shias beating themselves up, and you may wonder why do they do this. Sometimes very gruesome, which I personally don't think is good to do. But in any case, they will do it to feel the pain of Hussein, and it's a way. See, Shia Muslims for the longest period were living under a very hostile majority. The only way that they could show their dissent was through religion, was through mass protest. And the events of Karbala were used as their way of venting their opposition to the government. For a long time, Shia Muslims were not allowed to hold the commemorations of Karbala, and by the way, they're still not allowed in many countries in the world, including, believe it or not, in Malaysia. In Malaysia, you cannot officially hold any gathering Shia gathering. People do it in their own homes, and many a time they are arrested for doing that too. And we think that Malaysia is kind of a very moderate and open country, but not necessarily so. What the deeds of Hussein do is to create an intensive or a creative person who is a role model for Shia Muslims, at least, of one who is willing to give everything for his Lord. And you'll find that the events which occurred 1400 years ago are still marked until today in ever greater intensity. And especially after Saddam Hussein has gone from Iraq, we find up to 20 million Shia Muslims gather, not only Shia, but the majority of them are Shias, gather in Karbala on the 40th day after his martyrdom, which actually occurred only last week. As you may be aware, Hussein was confronted with a very tyrannical ruler, Yazid. The problem was that Yazid was demanding allegiance from Hussein. That was only part of the problem. For Hussein, it wasn't only that Yazid was demanding allegiance, but that the Muslims were willing to give him allegiance. In the olden days, the way that you voted was not going through a ballot, but the way that you voted is by giving allegiance to the ruler. And Hussein could not give that allegiance simply because by giving allegiance to Yazid, the tyrannical ruler, Hussein was kind of okaying him and accepting him as his ruler. And that basically meant that although Yazid himself was violating all the social religious norms that had been established by the Prophet himself. And let's not forget, Hussein was just not an ordinary person. He was the grandson of Muhammad. And so people were looking at Hussein, what he was doing. Because for them, if Hussein was to ally himself with Yazid, it was okay for them to do so. So Hussein fully knew the responsibilities that he was carrying, and that he could not under any circumstance accept Yazid as his ruler. There was something else which was bothering Hussein. Not only that people were willing to give allegiance to Yazid, but also the great social injustice and economic injustice that was rampant around him. Hussein was living during the time of the Umayyad period. That was the first dynasty in Islam. There was a lot of social disequilibrium. The poor were growing poorer, the rich were growing richer. We find that even during the time of a person by the name of Talha was a companion of the Prophet. He had accumulated so much gold that they had to take iron bars just to break that. And there were other acts which were immoral committed in the name of Islam. Yazid himself at one point even invaded Mecca. Women in Medina were raped. Islam basically had become a rich man's club. So obviously that put great emphasis or pressure on Hussein to do something about it, not to give in to a tyrannical ruler. We can glean a lot of Hussein's stances by some of the speeches that he delivered and the statements that he made, letters that he wrote. In one famous sermon that he gave, he says, "Ala tarawna an al-haqqa la yu'mal bih." Don't you see that the truth is not being practiced? Don't you see that the truth is not being practiced and falsehood is not being forbidden? So that a believer can meet his or her Lord on the right path. So for Hussein, the truth and justice are very important. It's interesting that in the Quran, there are many occasions when God, for Muslims, commands something. Sometimes he just recommends something, but there is a certain point where he actually directs Muslims that you must do this. Inna Allah ya'muru bil adli wal ihsan, that God requires you to be just and to do beautiful deeds. And interestingly, the two are conjoined, they're connected. That in order to do beautiful deeds, you must be just. In order to be just, you must be doing beautiful deeds. In other words, beautiful deeds towards fellow human beings. So for Hussein then, he wanted to make sure that the truth was being practiced. As somebody said correctly, that do not mourn their deaths, those who have died, but imitate their lives. And when Hussein was asked originally to give allegiance to Yazid, his response was, "Mithli la yubayyu mithla." Those like me cannot accept those like him. This was not a personal battle between Hussein and Yazid. It was a battle, in his view at least, between right and wrong, truth and falsehood. So Karbala for Muslims then is not just a historical event. It's a moral educator. Interestingly, by the way, something that we should understand, that the Quran, even Muslims don't quite get this. Many Muslims tend to think that the Quran is a book of law or a law book, or it's a book of history. It's not. The Quran doesn't tell us history. There is far more history in the Bible than there is in the Quran. Because the Quran doesn't tell us history, it tells us stories. So for example, when it talks about Abraham, when it talks about Moses, the Quran doesn't tell us where they were born, when they lived, who did they get married to, when they died. Nothing of that. It's just small snippets of their lives, small passages of their life, because the Quran wants to draw the morals from those stories. that we understand what it means to be morally upright, rather than the history of these people. There are many events during the day of Ashura, of Karbala, that I could go into. I don't have the time to do that. Just one or two things before I finish. There was a person that you may have heard of called Hur, H-U-R-R, who actually was responsible for arresting and stopping Hussein in the desert. And yet, on the day of Ashur, before the battle starts, his conscience was biting him, because he was the one who was responsible for bringing Hussein to Karbala. And now he realized that they were actually going to kill Hussein, they were going to fight him. Even though Hussein tried his very best not to fight them. But they said, you either accept Yazid or we will kill you. And not only kill you, but basically all your companions. And Hussein said, then if that's the case, then so be it. But Hur realizes, and he actually changed sides on the day of Ashur. He went to Hussein and begged for forgiveness. And Hussein was noble enough to actually forgive him. Say, okay, you may have done wrong, but since you repent, then you are forgiven. For Hussein, it was better to die honorably than to live in humiliation. In other words, to live in humiliation and injustice was unacceptable. That it is better to die in honor than to live in humiliation. And therefore, he gave a small talk. Basically, it's a supplication before he was killed. All his companions were killed, male companions were killed on the day of Ashur. There may have been about 200 of them altogether. 72 that we hear of were only the close companions, the close relatives of Hussein, but there were actually about 200 of them, and they were killed one by one. It all occurred within the span of about 3-4 hours. It did not take that long. But when he was all alone, Hussein said that, "Oh my Lord, oh, my only trust in every calamity, and my promise in every anxiety. On the day when my friends are no more, and my enemies are rejoicing, I submit to you alone. My complaint is to you alone. No one can relieve me from my grief and from what I'm going through." The best way to end, I think, that perhaps encapsulates Hussein's stance on the day in Karbala is the statement of a Sufi saint who says that, turning to God, the saint says, "The soul is precious, but for you I will exchange it. The soul is precious, but for you I will exchange it. Being slain is bitter, but in your path it becomes sweet." Being slain is bitter, but in your path it becomes sweet. Thank you very much. So if you don't ask questions, then I'll continue lecturing. That wouldn't be nice. So you better ask.
All right, wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Takim. So, questions? Macy.
Hi, yes. I think we're all familiar, right, well, after your lecture with the discussion of Imam Hussein and how he represents this struggle for justice. At what point, though, does pursuing justice, at what point is pursuing justice perceived by others as committing injustice as well? In other words, is there a point where if you are pursuing justice, what then does that justify? In other words, to what extent can you pursue it without harming someone else? Is that clear?
I think so. I think that, first of all, justice is measured by our common understanding or common sense of what is right and what is wrong. And that always is not always clear, because that also can change with time. But as long as one is pursuing it for the sake of justice without harming others, then it's okay. In other words, sometimes, in the pursuit of justice, you may harm yourself. And therefore, by the way, Hussein was very clear to his companions. He told them, all of them, that you can leave me. These people want me only. They don't want you. And they said, no, we are not going to leave you. We will die in front of you because we share your views, we share your ideals.
I have two questions. So, for the common ground that human beings can work together, you talked about the common sense or fitra. And I want to know how much this fitra or common sense is changing with cultures. Or in another way, for example, justice, it can be interpreted differently in different cultures. So how you compare it?
Yeah, I mean, it's not always easy to determine what is just in a particular context. But I think that the basic values, basic principles are shared. Like, when we see somebody is being killed, or when we see that a person is a perpetual liar, or when we see somebody who is obviously committing acts which are improper, we all feel a sense of revulsion. We all feel a sense of that this is wrong. Now, some aspects are culturally specific and culturally conditioned. I agree, whether, for example, acts which some religions may accept, some cultures may accept, and others will not. But I think for the basic values, that's what we are talking of what is morally right and morally wrong, of killing is evil, that lying is evil, that obedience to your parents is good, at least if you're a child. Those are commonly shared. But there comes a point that, that sense of justice also becomes culturally specific. That's where you run into many problems.
I wanted to know what your thoughts are on how the idea of justice being a part of the stance of Imam Hussein and how that's influencing modern Shia communities today.
How does that, how is Hussein somehow connected to modern Shia communities?
Yeah, as opposed to when you said before it was their means of protesting in a very hostile majority. But let's say here in the West, Shia communities today, the Shia youth, how do you feel that idea of justice and standing, with Imam Hussein and Karbala, how is that influencing the Shia?
In the West or just generally?
Let's focus on America.
In America, I think it is because if we talk of justice and equality, many of the I think there is an awakening within the Shia community that I've never seen for a long, long time. I've been in the West for 40 odd years, more than 40 years, and I haven't seen that sense of awareness and love for Hussein, the outpouring of grief that we see now. And that is translated in many ways towards establishing justice, or at least fighting for justice in different parts of the world. Especially for example, in Israel and Palestine, or what we see in Afghanistan and other parts of the world. And although those living in America have very limited scope, in the sense they can only voice their frustration or their ideals, shall we say, through proper channels, through lobbying, or whether it is trying to influence the Congress of how American foreign policy should be shaped. Unlike what happens in the Middle East, where things get a bit more violent.
Another question. So you talked about common things in human, and then you referred to the story of Adam. The story of Adam. And there is another interpretation that, so Adam is a representative of God because he's a prophet. And so the things that are explained about him is not true for everybody. So what's your, what do you have to support your idea that it's for everybody?
Yeah, because, the spirit that was breathed into Adam was not only to him. It's a metaphorical way of understanding that human beings carry the spirit of God. That human beings all have the sense of trust. The trust of God wasn't only offered to Adam. That human beings have this free will, if you like. Human beings have knowledge to choose right and wrong, or to know what is correct and what is not correct. So although it's only Adam is being addressed specifically, but it was more metaphorical for the children of Adam too. That human beings not only can choose, but they can also know. They can commit acts of evil. And therefore, when in the Quran, God says to the angels that I'm going to create Adam, human beings, and then the angels retort, are you going to create somebody who is actually going to spread corruption on earth? And it wasn't specifically Adam, but it was the children of Adam. Similarly, they were asked to bow down in front of Adam to show this superiority of human beings to angels because of the different aspects that they carry rather than the angels do.
I also have a question about what you mentioned with regards to the blasphemy. That it gets interpreted later, it's used later. What is the backstory of that? Where does that come up? If again there's explicit lines that said there's no compulsion in religion, how does that play? How is that?
There's nothing in the Quran about this. Mm-hmm. It's only in the traditions, and even that is of 2 or 3 people who satirized the Prophet, even used foul language against him. And that was offensive to many Muslims. So, they, according to tradition, at least they kill whoever, But that does not mean that, because that was seen as somehow creating chaos and, problems within the Muslim community at that time. But does that necessarily mean that we create laws of blasphemy? We do have laws in our own countries, by the way, which restricts any person who wants to use any kind of language. We have it here in America, Not that I would ever think about using the N-word, for example, or being anti-Semitic, because there is a difference between freedom of expression and freedom to abuse. And many a time it borders onto the freedom of abuse. Now this particular lady, I don't think, sometimes she may have said it out of fit of anger. I don't even know the full story. Or she may regret it. I don't think that, there really is a case of blasphemy.
About blasphemy laws, I believe, they were in Europe, particularly France, during Louis XIV first, before they were anywhere in the Islamic world. And they actually began, I believe, in British colonial India in the 19th century, imposed by the British. So it was actually, interestingly, outside of, Islam, the development of Islamic law, at least as codified law, which has its own history, in which blasphemy laws were put in place, and that's true for Afghanistan too, I believe. Not until I believe Saudi Arabia and Iran and Pakistan do you have actual codified blasphemy laws.
But they were there in these hadith books also, long before that.
But in terms of codified.
Codified. I honestly don't even think that Iran has ever actually punished anybody.
Right.
Saudi Arabia, you are likely to. I wouldn't even try it there. But it's interesting that when the Salman Rushdie thing came about, I was in England at that time, and we were told something that I never even thought was possible, which is that according to British law, it was okay to abuse Muhammad, to abuse Moses, but not Jesus. And I'm like, okay, so interesting. So Jesus is somehow spared from that, but it's okay to do it to Muhammad. And of course, I think now they've changed. I don't know. But this goes to show how skewed the law is. Okay, well, it's a great pleasure. It was a great pleasure, and thank you for being such a nice audience. Thank you.